Spring in Riverland never arrived quietly. The Coober River, winding its slow silver path along the town's edge, always broke its banks by March. But in 2018, the rains didn't stop. They came in long, unbroken sheets, drumming against roofs and turning the fields into lakes. The townspeople watched nervously as the river swelled higher with each passing day, until one night, without warning, it surged beyond anything they had seen in decades. The water rose like a beast waking from sleep, swallowing basements, crawling over driveways, flooding the old quarter near the dam where the houses leaned wearily on cracked foundations. On the far edge of Riverland, in a crumbling house where the shingles peeled back like old bark, lived Emma, a woman whose hair was the color of ash and whose steps had grown slower with the years. Her companion was a young puppy she had found months earlier, left in a soggy cardboard box on her porch. She had named him Teddy. He was small, all awkward limbs and a messy coat of white and rusty patches, with thick, alert ears and eyes too wise for his age. When the flood came, Emma was sleeping. The first warning was a rumble beneath the floor, not loud, but deep, a pressure that shifted the air. The water had already pushed into the crawl space, saturating the earth, pressing against the old beams. In the dark, under the weight of the rising water, part of the floor gave way with a sudden, splintering crack. Teddy fell through. The drop wasn't far, but it was enough. He tumbled into the half-submerged basement, landing in shallow, icy water. Dazed but unhurt, he scrambled to his paws, only to find the broken floorboards arching above him, trapping him like a box. A narrow gap near the base of the wall let in a trickle of air, but no way out. Emma woke at the sound. For a moment she thought it was the wind, but when she put her feet to the floor and felt the chill of standing water seep into her slippers, she knew something was wrong. She rushed outside, heart hammering against her ribs, and saw her yard transformed into a river. The rain fell in thick, blinding sheets, the yard light swallowed by mist. The world had been erased. She called Teddy's name, over and over, her voice breaking against the storm. No answer, no shape darting from the shadows to her feet. She stumbled back inside, calling again, searching the rooms, her hands shaking. It was only when she paused, straining to hear beyond the storm's roar, that she caught it, a faint, desperate yip, muffled and thin, rising from beneath the house. Teddy was there, trapped, alone. And the water kept rising. Teddy was trapped. The water continued to rise, slow but relentless, first brushing his paws, then soaking into his belly. The cold seeped through his thin fur, turning each breath into a shallow shiver. But he did not whimper. He did not howl. Instead, he called out, sharp, urgent yelps, spaced carefully, as if some instinct, deeper than fear, told him to conserve his strength but not his hope. Between the cracks of warped floorboards, his voice climbed upward, threading through the flooded air, into the roar of the rain. Each bark was a flare in the darkness, a signal tossed into a world too vast and loud to notice a single life. He would fall silent at times, the pauses long enough for doubt to creep in. But then, another bark. Thin, strained, but there. He didn't understand why the world had gone cold and wet. He didn't understand why the warm hand and the safe floor had disappeared. He knew only that silence was defeat. And he wasn't ready for silence. Above him, Emma huddled on the sagging porch beneath a battered umbrella. The wind turned the rain sideways, stinging her face, soaking the thin jacket wrapped around her shoulders. She kept her phone gripped tightly in her hand, but the screen showed no signal, no bars, no rescue. The water was climbing the steps now. She had tried everything. She had waved down the few cars that struggled through the flooded streets before they turned back. She had called out, screamed until her throat was raw. She had left messages for the emergency services that might never be heard. They had promised help would come when the water receded, but promises meant nothing against the ticking clock of the river. Emma knew. She knew the minutes mattered more than the hours, that small bodies lost heat faster, that hope wasn't something you could put on hold. She sat there, her body trembling with cold and helplessness, listening. Sometimes, through the roaring wind and the crackle of branches torn from trees, she heard it, a soft, broken yip floating up from beneath her feet. He was still there, still fighting, still calling for someone to answer. By morning, the floodwaters had slackened but not retreated. They hung heavy across the town like a second sky, a great mirror that reflected the pale, exhausted light of a washed-out dawn. Emma's house still stood, sagging on its fragile foundation, a stubborn island in a field of slow-moving water. Inside, the air was thick with dampness, and the creeping smell of mildew began to seep from the walls like a warning left too late. But worse than the decay was the silence. Teddy's voice was gone. No yips, no desperate scratches against the boards. Not in the gray light of morning. Not as the hours dragged into a slow, heavy afternoon. Emma sat on the porch wrapped in a sodden blanket, her hands tucked under her arms, rocking slightly without realizing it. Her eyes flickered at every small ripple on the water's surface, every groan of the shifting house. Her heart hammered with every false sound, with every nothing. The worst fear wasn't the flood. It was that she might have missed his last cry. All she could do was wait and listen. Wait and hope against the silence that settled deeper with every minute. The sun sank, barely a smudge behind the clouds. The light dimmed to a soft, ash-colored dusk. Then, when she had almost stopped believing she would hear anything at all, it came. A sound. So faint, she thought she had imagined it. A single, ragged bark, strained and hoarse like wind catching in a broken reed. Then another, weaker still, but real. Teddy was alive. Somewhere beneath the soaked wood and rising rot, he still fought. He still called. Emma pressed her hand to her mouth as tears blurred her vision, not from grief, but from the fragile, stubborn miracle of it. The tiny life beneath her feet, battered by cold and darkness, refused to be quiet, refused to disappear. In the vast, indifferent world, his voice rose again, thin and trembling. But there, he was still asking to be found. On the second day, when the rescue team finally arrived, the floodwaters still clung stubbornly to the earth, thick and glinting under a tired sky. Emma met them barefoot, her hair plastered to her scalp by rain, her voice no more than a rasp scraped raw from shouting into the storm. Two men in heavy jackets and waterproof boots stepped cautiously through the mud. One was older, methodical, already scanning the damaged house with weary eyes. The other was younger, Josh, with a rough voice that barked orders efficiently, but eyes so soft they seemed at odds with everything else about him. Josh listened when Emma pointed toward the broken floor. He didn't waste time asking unnecessary questions. He grabbed a crowbar and knelt in the puddled entryway, his breath misting in the damp air. The older man brought a bucket, and together they worked, prying up rotten planks, bailing out pockets of standing water, peeling back the house piece by piece. Underneath, near a cracked support beam, they found him. Teddy lay, pressed against the foundation wall, half submerged, soaked to the bone. His fur clung to his small frame in heavy mats, his body shivering in shallow, jerky spasms. He didn't move when the light fell on him. Only his eyes opened, wide, glassy, exhausted, but still alive. Josh crouched low, one hand extended slowly like approaching a wild thing. But Teddy didn't fight. He didn't shrink away. When Josh lifted him, cradling his sodden weight carefully against his chest, the little dog let out a tiny, broken whimper, more relief than pain, and then fell silent again. Emma ran to them, her hands trembling so badly she could hardly steady the blanket they wrapped around him. She climbed into the back seat of the rescue truck with Teddy tucked against her chest, whispering words that dissolved into the fabric of the wet blanket, words he might not hear but surely knew. Teddy shivered the entire ride to the veterinary clinic, his small body barely producing enough warmth to fight back the chill. His breathing was shallow but steady, his heart beating fast but stubborn. He was alive. He was broken and battered and soaked through with the flood, but somehow, against the odds, he was still here. The veterinarian delivered the verdict with careful, measured words. Hypothermia, the beginnings of pneumonia, but he still had a chance. Teddy was frail, but his heart was strong. And that was something not every patient carried with them through the door. They left him at the clinic under warm lights and soft towels. Emma returned to the little house alone, clutching the soaked blanket he had been wrapped in. The next morning she washed it, dried it by the stove, and brought it back to the clinic, laying it across her knees as she sat in the waiting room. She stayed for hours, silent, watching the comings and goings of strangers, but seeing none of them. Teddy's world had shrunk to the small metal space of his kennel. In the beginning, he barely moved, his tiny body curled tight, his breaths shallow and uncertain. His eyes stayed open, following every movement through the glass like a silent question. Emma sat where he could see her. Hours turned into a rhythm. Each day she returned, her hands cradling the old blanket, her presence soft and steady. On the second day, Teddy sniffed at the food placed near his paws. Weakly, almost absently, he took a bite. It was a small thing, but Emma caught it, the moment his will sparked again. By evening, he shifted his body closer to the bars, reaching toward the warmth just beyond them. On the third morning, when the vet opened the kennel door, Teddy did something no one expected. He stepped forward, not fast, not with the clumsy enthusiasm of a healthy puppy, but carefully, one paw at a time, his legs wobbling, his muscles stiff from disuse. He crossed the gap between himself and Emma without a sound, pressing his damp nose against her trembling hand. She didn't cry. She simply scooped him up, the blanket already waiting, and held him close as if anchoring him to the world. When they returned to the battered house, Emma didn't speak. She laid a new, clean blanket by the stove where the warmth still pulsed gently into the air. She opened a window just enough to let the spring breeze carry away the heavy scent of flood and fear. On the table, she placed a small tag she had ordered, Teddy's name etched neatly into it, polished and shining. He wasn't just rescued. He belonged. In the house where walls still bore the stains of the storm, there was now a heartbeat. A voice, small but steady, returned to the silence. By the spring of 2019, Riverland had installed a new early warning system and river monitoring network, a promise that what had happened would not be allowed to happen so easily again. On the day they unveiled it, the town gathered by the refurbished levee under banners and speeches, the scent of damp earth still clinging to the air. Emma stood among them, holding Teddy in her arms. He had grown. No longer the shivering bundle that fought against the flood, he was now lean, with a coat that gleamed under the shy spring sun. But his eyes had not changed. They still held that same steady, knowing weight, as if somewhere deep inside he remembered every heartbeat of that night. A local journalist snapped their photo. It appeared the next morning in the Riverland Gazette beneath the headline, "The Puppy Who Never Fell Silent." People stopped Emma in the street, bent down to stroke Teddy's head, told her he was brave, a little miracle. She only smiled softly, knowing the truth was simpler. Down the street, Nate, a boy from the neighboring house, spoke shyly to a group gathered around the new flood sensors. He said that Teddy had taught him something no adult ever quite managed to explain, not to be afraid to call for help, because when Teddy called, someone answered. That was all it had taken. In a world that too often drowned out small voices, Teddy's had risen up through rain and wreckage, through darkness and fear, not to demand, not to command, just to be heard. Maybe that, after all, was the real heart of survival. Not the strength to endure alone, but the courage to call out when you could not. Teddy was never a hero in the grand shining way that stories like to tell. He was just a voice, small and stubborn, refusing to disappear. And in that, he became everything. In the state of Virginia, Near the small town of Bayford, a thick mist rolled through the forests in the early morning hours of 2021. Spring had only just begun to unfold. The earth exhaled moisture into the air, and the trees, still hesitant, clutched the last of their winter bareness. Birds sang sparsely, their songs thin and cautious, not yet ready to claim the season. At the very edge of the woods lived Thomas, a retired forest ranger, now 63 years old. His house was small, tucked against the first rise of the hills, its windows blurred by the morning fog. Thomas lived simply, finding comfort in the steady rituals of the land that had shaped him. His only constant companion was Ramsey. Ramsey was a large dog, steady and silent, with a thick coat the color of lichen and old moss. Part Labrador, part Newfoundland, he carried the slow, deliberate grace of the woods themselves. His eyes were dark and serious, pools of patience, and he moved with the kind of caution that only years in the wild could teach. Every morning, Thomas and Ramsey walked the old trails, paths Thomas had once patrolled for work, now wandered simply for the peace they offered. The trails twisted through dense groves of pine and oak, climbed over worn hills, and dipped into valleys where the mist hung low like a second ground. That morning the mist was heavier than usual. It pressed close, swallowing sound, muffling footsteps, blurring the familiar shapes of trees into tall, ghostly figures. Even Ramsey slowed, his nose lifting into the thick air, muscles tense beneath his fur. Thomas adjusted the strap of his worn satchel and followed the dog's lead. He trusted Ramsey's instincts more than his own aging senses. In the fog, every rock and branch looked the same. Only Ramsey could weave through the landscape without doubt. They moved slowly, breathing in the cool dampness. It wasn't a morning for talking. It was a morning for listening, to the drip of water from branch to earth, to the faint creak of trees shifting, to the almost imperceptible rustle of life hidden in the undergrowth. The forest, shrouded in white, felt endless, like the world had folded in on itself and left only them walking through it. Thomas didn't question it. He simply kept pace with Ramsey, letting the dog's steady presence anchor him to the path he could no longer see. The fawn lay alone, a trembling shape almost indistinguishable from the damp earth. No sign of a mother nearby, no whisper of movement in the surrounding thickets. Only the slight shiver of a fragile body pressing itself closer to the ground, instinctively trying to disappear. Thomas paused, narrowing his eyes against the mist. He knew it wasn't uncommon for mother deer to leave their young hidden while they foraged. But usually, the fawns were tucked away in denser parts of the woods, not exposed on an open stretch like this. And here, so close to the back roads where cars sometimes thundered past, the risks were higher. The air itself seemed heavy with the faint, acrid scent of coyotes, invisible but close. Cautiously, Thomas stepped forward, his boots sinking softly into the mossy trail. But before he could get close, Ramsey moved. The big dog shifted smoothly between Thomas and the fawn, planting himself firmly in the middle. He did not growl, did not bare his teeth. He simply stood there, silent and immovable, a living shield. Thomas stopped. He understood. Ramsey lowered his massive head and gently licked the side of the fawn, a slow, deliberate motion, as if offering comfort rather than claiming possession. The fawn flinched but did not pull away. It quivered under the dog's careful touch, then stilled, its breathing slowing, though it remained curled tight against the ground. Hours stretched thinly between them. The mist slowly thinned, revealing faint streaks of pale blue sky. A reluctant sun began to tease the edges of the world back into focus. Thomas sank onto a fallen log a few feet away, watching without speaking. Ramsey settled beside the fawn, his body curving protectively around the tiny creature. His thick coat provided warmth where the spring air still held a biting chill. The fawn shifted once, tucking its muzzle against Ramsey's flank. And then, for the first time, seemed to breathe without fear. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. He knew better than to rush. Sometimes real help wasn't loud or immediate. Sometimes it wasn't about lifting or fixing or even speaking. Sometimes the greatest gift you could offer was to simply stay. To sit beside a trembling soul and say without words, "You are not alone." By midday, the forest began to stir. The skeletal creak of branches shifted with each rare gust of wind. Far off, crows exchanged ragged calls, their voices breaking the delicate hush. But along with the sounds of life came others, quieter and sharper. The faint rustle of leaves, the careful snap of a twig under deliberate weight. Thomas stiffened. He knew what it meant. Predators had caught the scent. Ramsey rose silently, his massive frame drawing itself into taut readiness. His fur bristled along the spine, standing up in thick ridges. He did not bark. He made no sound at all. Instead, he positioned himself directly over the fawn, his body a silent barrier between the vulnerable creature and the unseen dangers closing in. Thomas moved slowly, deliberately, careful not to make any sudden noise that might invite chaos. He reached into his worn canvas satchel and pulled out an old hiking stick, the tip of which was adorned with a battered brass bell. It was a trick from years back. The sharp, unexpected ring often startled scavengers long enough to buy time. He shook the stick once, and the bell's high metallic note cut through the mist like a blade. From the underbrush to the left, a shape flickered, low to the ground, narrow-shouldered, cautious. A coyote. Its eyes glinted for just a heartbeat before it melted backward into the shadows, unwilling to challenge the towering dog whose gaze alone promised a fight it would not win. Ramsey never flinched. He remained over the fawn, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. His muscles vibrated with contained energy, a dam ready to break if necessary. But no attack came. The forest held its breath. The fawn did not stir beneath him. It seemed to understand, in the pure instinctive way that creatures sometimes do, that it was being protected, that for now, no harm could reach it. Thomas kept his eyes on the tree line, his hand still lightly tapping the bell. They were not safe yet. The woods were full of shadows, but sometimes, a shadow could stand guard too. Several more hours slipped by, heavy and slow, as the forest shifted from the dense mist of morning into the damp, restless breath of afternoon. Thomas managed to reach the local wildlife rehabilitation center on his old two-way radio, explaining the situation in short, urgent bursts. They promised to send help, but warned that the back roads were still slick and partially washed out from the recent rains. It would take time. In the meantime, Ramsey remained where he was, a steadfast figure beside the fragile life that had fallen into his care. After a while, he lay down again, curling his large body protectively around the fawn. His paws, broad and steady, formed a kind of barrier, a wall built not from aggression but from quiet determination. Every noise that rippled through the trees drew his attention, a snap of a twig, a gust of wind, the scurry of a distant animal. His ears twitched, his head lifted, but he did not leave his post. The weight of responsibility seemed stitched into his very being. The fawn, in its trembling innocence, sensed it too. Slowly, cautiously, it began to respond, nudging its tiny, damp nose into Ramsey's thick fur, seeking warmth, seeking comfort. Once or twice it dozed, its small head resting trustingly atop Ramsey's outstretched paw, its sides rising and falling in the tentative rhythm of sleep. Thomas stayed back, letting the bond unfold without interference. He knew what he was witnessing was rare, something beyond simple instinct. When the team from the center finally arrived, bumping their way down the muddy trail in a battered truck, they stepped out into a silence so complete it felt sacred. They froze for a moment, taking in the scene. The old man, weathered and still as a stone, the great moss-colored dog wrapped around a shivering scrap of life. They spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the fragile bridge that had formed here. A bridge between fear and safety, between wild and tame, between worlds that rarely touched. Ramsay lifted his head, but did not move away. He stayed until the hands that reached for the fawn were sure and gentle, until the danger was passed not just by his judgment, but by something deeper. Only then did he step back, slow and reluctant, his dark eyes never leaving the fawn until it was safely cradled in careful arms. Ramsay did not want to let go. When the fawn was gently bundled into a thick, worn blanket and lifted onto a stretcher, he rose immediately, his paws pressing into the damp earth. He followed, close but silent, his head low, his body tense with something that wasn't fear but wasn't peace either. Thomas called his name softly, a thread of sound pulled through the heavy air. Ramsay paused but did not immediately return. His eyes remained fixed on the small bundle until the back of the Wildlife Center's truck closed with a muted thud, and the fawn disappeared from view. Only then, reluctantly, Ramsay turned. The walk back home was slow. Ramsay kept close to Thomas's side, not dragging from exhaustion, but moving with the weight of someone who had just handed over something he could never retrieve. His movements were thoughtful, measured, as if every step was a quiet acknowledgement of something he could not name. Thomas reached out and rested a calloused hand on the dog's broad back, feeling the steady warmth beneath the damp fur. No words were needed. They walked together along the mist-laden path, leaving the clearing, the fallen branches, and the echoes of small, defiant life behind them. When they reached the cabin, Ramsay did not immediately retreat to his usual corner by the hearth. Instead, he settled himself by the front door, his head resting against the threshold, his body facing outward. Through the open window, the woods whispered and shifted in the cooling air. The world carried on, unaware of the small piece of it that had just been mended and released. All evening, Ramsay lay there, occasionally lifting his head at the slightest sound outside, the crackle of a branch, the flutter of an owl's wings, the distant trickle of water over stones. But no fawn's cry came, no soft hoofsteps returned. Night fell. The cabin sank into its familiar hush, the fire dying into embers. Thomas sat in his old armchair, the light from a single lamp pooling around him, watching the shape of the dog by the door. Ramsay did not whine. He did not pace. He simply kept vigil, his stillness saying what he could not. He had given everything he could. He had stayed as long as he was needed. Now, in the quiet, he stayed still, not because he was waiting for someone to return, but because part of him remained there, out in the woods, forever curled around a fragile heartbeat he had once kept safe. A month later, a letter arrived at the cabin, carried in the worn satchel of the town's only mailman. Thomas opened it carefully, as if the weight of the paper might crumble in his hands. It was from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The words were simple but full of quiet pride. The fawn had survived. They had named him Spark, not because of his smallness, but because of the fire he had lit in everyone who had helped save him. When he grew stronger, they wrote, he would be released back into the wild, where he belonged. Thomas read the letter aloud, sitting by the window with the spring sun casting long stripes of gold across the floor. Ramsay lay stretched at his feet, his head resting on his paws. He did not understand the words, but he listened all the same. He felt the slow, steady hum of something finished but not forgotten. When the days grew warmer and the forest began to shift from muddy brown to vibrant green, Thomas and Ramsay took the old trail again. The path had dried, the branches above knitted themselves into a pale green canopy, and the bird's song was stronger now, more certain. At the place where the fawn had once lain trembling against the cold earth, Ramsay slowed. His steps became careful, almost reverent. He sniffed the ground, lifted his head to the breeze, and turned his gaze toward the dense line of trees beyond. Then he sat down. He did not whine or search. He simply sat, breathing in the living, pulsing scent of the woods, as if to say, this was enough. This was right. Thomas stood quietly behind him, feeling the press of memory against the fresh air, feeling how time could bend but never erase certain moments. Because sometimes, salvation was not a matter of fighting or fleeing. Sometimes it was about staying, about warmth offered without expectation, about presence that asked for nothing in return. And sometimes, the quiet acts left deeper footprints than all the noise in the world. Ramsey stayed there for a long while, ears flicking gently at the whisper of the forest, his body relaxed, his spirit at ease. Some marks you leave are not seen by the eye, but carried forever in the heart. If this story touched your heart and you love animals, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the town of South Haven, Maine, spring always arrived in a rush. In 2022, the ice melt was especially swift, and the Willow River broke its banks. The forests around town brimmed with water, footpaths turned into creeks, and dips along the shore became hidden traps. Not far from the old bridge that marked the start of a country road lived Maddie, a stray dog with thick, dark fur and sharp, intelligent eyes. She had long since stopped trusting humans, but stayed close to nearby farms, surviving on scraps offered by elderly residents and school children. One gray afternoon, the wind carried a sharp, panicked sound. Maddie froze, ears twitching. Downriver, something flailed in the rushing current. A small figure, barely visible between the swells. A puppy, white and russet, too young to swim, caught in the icy flow. Its legs churned against the water, trying to find footing that wasn't there. Maddie didn't hesitate. Her muscles tensed, and with a single leap, she bolted from the muddy riverbank and dove into the torrent. The cold slammed into her body, but she kicked hard against the pull. Her eyes stayed locked on the struggling pup, her paws slicing through the current. The puppy yelped again, a weak, desperate sound swallowed by the roar of the swollen river. She pushed forward, fighting not just the water, but time. The current tugged at her sides. Spinning debris brushed her legs, but Maddie pressed on. The puppy slipped beneath the surface once, twice, and then her teeth found fur. She clamped gently, turning toward a fallen tree wedged diagonally across the flow, the only shelter from the water's grip. With one last push, she dragged him up onto the slick trunk and hauled herself beside him. The tree trembled beneath their weight, the river snarling below. The puppy shook, barely conscious, and Maddie curled around him without pause. Her body, soaked and shivering, pressed against his tiny form, shielding him from the wind. Above them, the sky hung heavy with clouds, and the world seemed to pause, just long enough for hope to hold its breath. The current surged violently around them. Maddie swam close to the surface, her head lifted high above the churning water, eyes fixed on the flailing figure ahead. The puppy was slipping under again and again, each gasp for air more frantic, each kick weaker. His limbs no longer moved with intention, just reflex, a body beginning to give in. Maddie lunged forward, closing the gap with powerful strokes. Her jaws found the loose scruff of his soaked neck just before he vanished again beneath a swell. With a strained grunt, she jerked her head back and began dragging him toward the one thing that stood out in the chaos. A thick tree trunk jammed halfway across the river, caught between rocks and current, half submerged and trembling under the force of the water. Her legs ached, lungs burned, and her soaked coat dragged her down. But she didn't let go. The climb was slow. Maddie pushed herself up onto the slick bark with claws scrabbling for hold, never loosening her grip on the pup. She collapsed half over him, panting, her legs trembling from exertion. The tree groaned beneath them, shifting slightly with every surge of the river. The banks were far, steep, and glazed with mud. The water that clung to her fur was ice. Escape was not an option. Not yet. The puppy squirmed weakly, his body racked with trembling. His tiny frame emitted high-pitched whimpers, more from fear than pain. Maddie curled herself around him, drawing his body tightly against her own. Her muzzle brushed over his ears, his paws, his cold little nose. Her tongue worked in short, purposeful strokes, as if trying to coax warmth back into him by will alone. The wind cut through the forested riverbanks, rattling leaves and driving the mist sideways across the water. Maddie pressed her eyes shut for a moment and buried her snout deeper into the puppy's neck, shielding him from the gusts. The trunk rocked beneath them. They were no longer swimming, but they were still surrounded by the same threat. The river hissed at their sides, licking up against the bark like it meant to claim them still. But Maddie didn't move. She wouldn't move. Above them, the world raged with water and wind. But between her ribs, a heartbeat held steady, and against her chest, a smaller one answered. Hours had passed. The river's surge had softened, but the road remained submerged, the landscape around the bridge still cut off by the flooding. No one walked the path. No voices called out. The world had moved on, unaware that, out on a half-submerged trunk in the middle of the swollen water, two lives clung to one another in silence. Maddie hadn't moved. She lay wrapped around the puppy like a living barrier. Her body trembled from cold, her muscles cramped from stillness, but her instincts refused to release her hold. Every so often, when the pup began to slip into sleep, she would raise her head and release a long, low howl. Not a cry for help, not anymore, but a call to keep the tiny heartbeat near her from fading. Each note was deliberate, vibrating with effort. A voice spent not on panic, but on preservation. The wind had changed by afternoon, growing heavier with rain. Mist clung to the banks, curling into the branches overhead. The puppy stirred only slightly, his nose tucked under Maddie's leg. His body pressed so tightly against hers that only the faintest motion gave away his breath. Maddie's own breathing had grown shallow. Her eyes fluttered, her strength slowly giving way to cold and time. But still she lifted her head and howled, again and again, until finally, near evening, something broke through the gray silence. The crunch of tires on gravel. A thin beam of light swaying through mist. A bike. A teenage boy named Luke was riding home from a short fishing trip. He'd taken the back trail to avoid the traffic on the main road, the path that wound along the flooded river. When the faint, unnatural sound reached his ears, a drawn-out cry, oddly rhythmic, he braked hard. He walked to the edge of the embankment, gripping his handlebars, and when his eyes adjusted to the gloom below, he saw them. A dog, dark-coated, soaked to the bone, lying half on a trunk barely above waterline. Her limbs were curled protectively around a trembling, pale-furred puppy. Her head was raised. Her eyes, deep, hollow with exhaustion, were fixed on him. Not pleading, just waiting. It was the kind of look that didn't ask for anything, but gave everything. One Luke would remember for the rest of his life. Luke ran as fast as his legs would carry him, slipping through puddles and over half-hidden roots. His breath came in sharp bursts. The image of the dog and puppy burned behind his eyes. When he burst through the back door, he didn't need to say much. His father, a firefighter who'd seen his share of emergencies, was already grabbing his jacket. Two neighbors joined them with climbing rope and a weathered gear bag. They knew the river. They knew the bridge. Within 10 minutes, they were there. The descent was difficult. Rain-soaked clay made every step treacherous. The current below tugged at the trunks and branches, hiding sudden drops and sharp limbs beneath the surface. But they moved quickly, one man anchoring the rope while another, Evan, a quiet man with a climber's balance, started across the slick remains of the felled tree. The dog didn't move. Maddie remained where she was, her body still wrapped loosely around the puppy. She didn't bark. She didn't growl. Only her eyes followed every step of the man approaching. When he finally reached them, crouching low and extending a gloved hand toward the pup, Maddie tensed, but didn't resist. She held her breath until she felt the hands close gently around the pup's damp fur. And then, only then, did she step back. Evan lifted the small bundle into his arms, wrapping the puppy in a blanket. The pup whimpered once, then went still again, eyes barely open. Evan turned to signal, but as he reached out toward Maddie, she let out a warning hiss. Not of aggression, but of confusion, of protective fear. Her body lowered again, unsure, coiled in silent resistance. That was when Luke stepped forward. He lowered himself carefully onto the muddy edge, moving slowly, ignoring the cold as he crept closer to where Maddie stood. He crouched beside the man and extended his hand, palm up, fingers steady, letting the wind carry his scent. Maddie hesitated. Then she stepped forward. The boy's scent stirred something in her memory. He was the one who left food behind the school on quiet afternoons. A crust of bread, a half sandwich. Never loud, never chasing, just presence. She nudged his hand, nose cold and wet. And when he gently touched her shoulder, she leaned into it, just slightly. That was all the permission they needed. Evan secured the harness around her with quick, practiced motions, and together they began the slow journey back across the flood-drenched tree. 2 lives no longer stranded. They named the puppy Split, for the dark streak running along his back, and because he had been rescued in the space between 2 worlds, river and land, fear and safety. The vet confirmed he was healthy, just exhausted and chilled. With warmth, food, and quiet, Split began to recover. His small frame filled out, his eyes grew clearer, and his steps more sure. But he never strayed far from the one who had kept him alive. Maddie stayed too. She didn't become a pet in the traditional sense. She didn't curl up at the foot of the bed or learn to play fetch. She chose the porch, the back shed, the soft earth near the apple trees. She stayed on the edge of things, but never far. Luke and his family understood. They didn't try to train her or coax her inside. They left doors ajar, bowls of food beneath the steps, blankets under the eaves. Maddie made her own way to belonging, and that, somehow, made her part of the family more completely than if they had tried to force it. Split was different. He was all tail wags and tumbling paws, an explosion of life that followed Maddie everywhere. He tripped over garden tools, chewed on fence posts, barked at the wind. But every night, when the house quieted and the sky turned the color of coal dust, he curled beside Maddie and tucked his head against her ribs, his breath syncing with hers. She never moved until he was asleep. The neighbors started noticing them, the way they moved like one being, the way Maddie watched Split with a gaze that held something deeper than duty. She wasn't just a rescuer. She had become a keeper, a guardian not just of a life, but of the space that life was allowed to grow into. Some said she reminded them of something old, a loyalty unshaken by hardship, a heart that didn't ask for anything in return. No leash, no collar, just an open gate and a dog who had chosen to stay. 6 months had passed. The flood was a memory now, whispered about in the town diner, half faded in newspaper clippings on the bulletin board near the post office. But for Luke, and for the 2 lives he had watched change, it hadn't faded. One soft afternoon, when the sky was stretched with clouds and the air smelled faintly of river mud and pine, Luke took Split and Maddie back to the place. The Willow River had long since retreated to its usual course. The banks were firm again, though still scarred in places, and the tree, the one that had caught them, lay with its roots exposed, half bleached by sun and time. Maddie stepped ahead without prompting. Her gait was slower now, more measured, as if she understood the gravity of return. She walked straight to the downed tree, to the space where the current had once tried to take everything. She sniffed the ground, circled once, and then, quietly, lay down. Split, bigger now, but still with that unsure, hopeful bounce in his step, nestled beside her. His body no longer trembled from cold, but he leaned into her anyway, as if the imprint of that long day still lived inside his bones. Luke sat a little behind them, not wanting to intrude. He watched the 2 of them, framed by roots and branches, by wind and memory, and felt something in his chest shift. Maddie hadn't been a fighter in the usual sense. She hadn't barked for help, hadn't tried to drag the puppy to shore with brute force. She had simply stayed. That was her rescue. She had wrapped herself around life and held on. And sometimes, maybe most times, that was enough to make the difference. People in South Haven still talked about the flood. But what stayed with them even more than the water was what followed it. The image of a dog on a log, refusing to let go of what she had saved. No medals were given, no monuments raised. But if you walked past the bend in the river at dusk, sometimes you'd see her there, Maddie, lying quiet as the water rolled by, split curled close, Luke watching from the grass. Sometimes being a hero isn't about the moment everything changes. Sometimes it's about what and who you refuse to let go of. If this story touched your heart and you love animals, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the winter of 2020, in the small town of Elm Hollow, Wisconsin, winter arrived with sudden force. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, covering roofs, streets, and fields under a heavy, wet blanket. The world looked muted, soundless, wrapped tightly in white silence. The air was thick with cold, each breath slicing sharply through the lungs. Claire, a retired schoolteacher, lived at the edge of town in a small, weathered house tucked against the forest's first rise. Her life was simple, quiet, shaped by steady routines and the changing seasons. Her only constant companion was Brody, a large golden retriever with gentle eyes and a calm spirit. He moved through the world with the patient grace of one who had seen many winters and trusted the rhythm of the earth more than the frantic pace of people. That day, as the snow drifted in slow, lazy spirals from a heavy gray sky, Claire buttoned her thick coat and pulled on her boots. Brody waited at the door, his tail wagging once, then falling still. Together they stepped into the whiteness, the snow crunching softly underfoot. The road was barely visible, swallowed by snowdrifts. Trees loomed like dark ghosts, their bare branches bending under the weight of ice. It wasn't a morning for long walks, but Claire felt a pull to move, to breathe the sharp, clean air despite the cold that bit into her skin. Brody was different that morning. His head was low, his nose working furiously through the layers of scent the snow tried to smother. His steps were quicker, more urgent. Claire noticed, frowning slightly. Usually he matched her slow, careful pace. She tugged her scarf tighter around her neck and turned to call him back. But before she could, Brody froze. His entire body stiffened, ears pricked, muscles tense beneath his thick fur. For a heartbeat, everything held still. The snow, the trees, the very air around them. Then, without warning, Brody bolted off the trail, plunging into the deeper snow toward the dark edge of the woods. Claire gasped and hurried after him, stumbling through the drifts. Her heart pounded, not from the effort, but from the sudden certainty that something was wrong. Ahead, Brody disappeared into a dip in the land, a narrow ravine hidden by the snowfall. Claire followed, slipping and sliding, her hands raw from the cold. At the bottom of the ravine, Brody stood motionless, his body blocking something small and shivering half buried in the snow. Claire's breath caught painfully in her chest. There, almost invisible against the white, was a tiny, motionless kitten. And Brody, her steadfast, gentle Brody, had found him. Claire moved carefully through the deep snow, her boots sinking past her ankles with each step. The cold clung to her, numbing her fingers even inside her gloves. Ahead, Brody had stopped, his golden fur dusted with white, almost blending into the endless expanse of snow. His posture was rigid but gentle, his body low to the ground. As Claire drew closer, she saw it. A tiny hollow in the snow, sheltered slightly by a bend in the land, where something small and gray lay curled. For a terrifying moment, she thought it was already too late. The little bundle barely moved, its fur clumped with ice, its body so still it seemed carved from frost itself. A kitten, so small it barely seemed real. Its paws were tucked tightly under its body, its eyes squeezed shut against the cold. Claire knelt beside the hollow, feeling the wetness of the snow soak through the knees of her jeans. She reached out carefully but stopped herself. Her hands were too cold, too clumsy. She could hurt it without meaning to. Brody moved before she could. With infinite care, he lay down beside the kitten, curling his body protectively around it. His thick fur created a wall against the wind, his body heat seeping slowly into the frozen little frame. He nudged the kitten closer with his muzzle, then placed one massive paw gently over the trembling body, as if to anchor it to life. His other paw brushed lightly against the kitten's head, and he began to lick its tiny face with deliberate strokes, clearing away the ice. Claire watched, her throat tightening. This wasn't instinct. This was something more. Brody knew. He understood. She pulled out her phone, her fingers stiff and clumsy, and tried to dial the local rescue service. The screen flickered. No signal. She tried again. Still nothing. The blizzard had knocked out the lines. Even if she could reach someone, help wouldn't come fast enough. Claire looked up at the sky. Snow fell thicker now, heavy and relentless, reducing the world to a whirling, suffocating whiteness. The path home was already nearly invisible. Turning back quickly with Brody and the kitten wasn't an option. They would have to stay. She pulled her scarf higher over her mouth and nose and crouched lower into the hollow, letting the snow pile around them for shelter. She untied her thick woolen coat and draped it across Brody and the kitten, sacrificing her own warmth to create a pocket of heat around the two. The kitten stirred slightly under the weight of the coat, a faint twitch of its ear, a flicker of breath. Claire dared to hope. She pulled Brody closer with soft words he didn't need to hear to understand. He pressed in tighter against the kitten, his breathing steady and deep. Minutes blurred into hours. Claire lost all sense of time, measuring it only by the kitten's breathing, by the slow rise and fall of Brody's chest, by the numbness creeping steadily into her own body. The snow cocooned them, muffling everything. In that small hollow, in the endless field of white, 3 fragile lives huddled together, clinging to the thread of warmth they had stitched between them. Claire kept her eyes open, forcing herself to stay awake. She knew that if she let herself drift, it could be the end. For her, for the kitten, even for Brody. She thought about how easy it would have been to miss the tiny life buried under the snow, about how most would have passed by without knowing, about how sometimes salvation didn't come from plans or strength, but from something quieter, attention, care, the refusal to leave another soul alone. Brody shifted slightly, adjusting the kitten closer to his chest. The little one let out a tiny, almost imperceptible mewl. Claire let out a shaky breath, tears freezing on her lashes. They would stay. They would wait. They would not give up. Above them, the snow kept falling, sealing them into their small, defiant shelter. A single point of warmth in an endless, frozen world. Claire fumbled through the stiff fabric of her coat until she found the old woolen blanket tucked deep inside her satchel. She had carried it for years, a habit left over from her hiking days, when weather in Wisconsin could turn treacherous in an instant. She unfolded it with numb fingers and draped it carefully over Brody and the kitten. Brody did not move. He simply adjusted slightly to better shield the fragile body pressed against him. His breathing was slow and deep, the steady rhythm of a dog who understood his role and accepted it without hesitation. The blanket settled heavily over him, trapping what little warmth they had between its frayed folds. The kitten trembled beneath the layers. Tiny spasms ran through its damp, frail body. Sometimes it whimpered, small, broken sounds that barely pierced the thick silence around them. Other times it lay frighteningly still, and Claire found herself leaning closer, straining to see the faint rise and fall of its chest. She stayed by their side, afraid to move too much, afraid to disturb the fragile balance they had created. Her own body was beginning to betray her, fingers stiff, toes numb, the ache of cold burrowing deep into her bones. Every breath she took seared her lungs with icy sharpness. Above them, the snow continued to fall. Thick, heavy flakes blurred the world into a uniform white, burying the trail they had come from and erasing any landmarks. The hollow where they huddled felt like a tiny island adrift in a frozen sea, isolated and unseen. Time lost its meaning. Minutes stretched impossibly long, ticking by with the slow, dragging weight of exhaustion and cold. Claire pressed her hand gently against Brody's side, feeling the faint heat radiating through the blanket. She whispered to him. Soft, broken words carried more by hope than sound. Not to encourage him, not even to encourage the kitten, but to anchor herself against the rising tide of fear. She knew the kitten's life balanced on the thinnest of threads. Every hour spent exposed to the cold was another hour closer to losing that tiny heartbeat. Claire could feel the pressure of helplessness building inside her, a gnawing, silent panic. But Brody remained steadfast. His body curled tighter around the kitten, his head low and still. His loyalty was absolute. A quiet, enduring thing that asked for nothing and gave everything. The wind picked up in bursts, rattling through the bare branches overhead. Claire hunched lower, pulling the edges of her coat tighter, shielding the little shelter they had built together. She tried not to think about how far they were from home, about how alone they were, about how easily the woods could forget they were even there. Instead, she focused on the faint warmth beneath her palm, on the slow, stubborn beat of life nestled against Brody's chest. She told herself they would make it. They had to. Because sometimes survival wasn't about strength or speed. Sometimes it was about waiting, about enduring, about refusing to let go. And in that quiet, frozen clearing, Claire, Brody, and a trembling scrap of life waited together, holding on to a hope as fragile and vital as breath itself. When the blizzard finally eased and the crackling of a faint signal returned to her phone, Claire managed to call her neighbor. Her voice trembled as she explained their situation, the words tumbling out in short, urgent bursts. The neighbor, a retired mechanic named Harold, promised he would come as soon as he could. Half an hour later, the low rumble of his old four-wheel drive truck broke through the stillness of the ravine. Claire waved her arms weakly to guide him, her body stiff with cold. Harold and his teenage son trudged through the snow, carrying a thick blanket between them. Together they helped Claire to her feet and carefully lifted Brody and the small trembling bundle wrapped in wool onto the back seat of the truck. Brody refused to leave the kitten even for a moment. He climbed into the truck bed, curling his large frame around the tiny life he had protected for so long. The drive home was slow and careful. The roads were still slick, and snowbanks rose like frozen waves on either side of the narrow path. Inside the cab, the heater groaned, fighting to fill the air with warmth. Claire watched Brody from the corner of her eye, watched the way he shielded the kitten with his body, his paws forming a careful barrier, his nose nudging the kitten gently when it shivered. Back at the house, Harold helped Claire inside while his son carried the supplies. Claire quickly cleared a spot in front of the fireplace, layering thick quilts and old comforters over the rug. She lit the fire with shaking hands, feeding it until the flames grew strong and steady. Brody settled himself on the blankets without hesitation, still cradling the kitten against his chest. Claire knelt beside them, gently peeling away the wet wool that clung to the kitten's fur. She wrapped the little body in a fresh towel, warming it between her palms before reaching for the small bottle of milk she kept for emergencies. The kitten stirred weakly, its tiny mouth opening in a feeble mewl. Claire used a pipette to offer a few drops of warm milk. At first, the kitten barely responded, but after a few minutes, it latched on, drawing in the life it so desperately needed. Brody watched the process with unwavering attention, his head low, his dark eyes filled with quiet urgency. Only when Claire tucked the kitten into a dry blanket, placed carefully beside him, and smoothed the edges over its fragile body, did Brody allow himself to relax. He let out a long, slow breath and lowered his head onto the folded quilts. His body curled protectively around the kitten one last time before sleep finally claimed him. The fire crackled, casting a soft orange glow across the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, there was warmth, breath, and the steady promise of survival. Together, they had made it home. Weeks slipped by, and the little kitten survived. Claire named him Snoops, for his smoky gray coat that seemed spun from drifting snow and mist. Snoops grew stronger quickly, his legs gaining coordination, his tiny heart finding rhythm. He became inseparable from Brody, shadowing him from room to room, curling beneath his broad chest when frightened by a sudden noise or a heavy footstep. Brody accepted it all with infinite patience. He endured the playful nips at his ears, the daring leaps onto his back, and the clumsy attempts to scale his large, warm body. He moved carefully, always aware of the small life clinging to him, adjusting his steps to protect him. Claire often caught herself smiling as she watched them together. In Brody's steady presence and Snoops's unbreakable trust, she saw something rare, a bond born not of chance, but of choice. If Brody had not found him, if he had not stayed, the thought was too heavy to finish. Instead, she focused on what was in front of her, a playful kitten growing into a brave young cat, and a dog who never once let him out of his gentle, watchful care. By the time spring came, the heavy snows of Elm Hollow had melted into memory. The fields once buried in white were now dressed in soft green, and the streams, swollen with melted ice, murmured quietly along their banks. The air smelled of damp earth and new life. One afternoon, Claire, Brody, and Snoops returned to the old ravine. The place looked different without the weight of winter. Open, breathing, alive. Brody paused at the edge, lifting his nose to the breeze, his body still, as if remembering something carried in the scent. Claire stood behind him, one hand resting lightly on his back. Snoops, larger now but still slight compared to Brody, padded forward cautiously. He sniffed at the grass, his tail twitching with curiosity. He seemed to sense something lingering in the soil, something deeper than just the passage of time. Brody looked back at Claire for a moment, then turned his gaze outward again, standing firm, not searching, not waiting, simply being. Sometimes salvation did not begin with shouts or grand gestures. Sometimes it was born from something smaller, the quiet sharing of warmth, the simple choice to stay beside someone who needed you. Brody never knew he had done something extraordinary. He had only followed what was already stitched into his soul. To protect, to endure, to give without expectation. And in that silent choice, 2 lives had been changed forever. If this story touched your heart and you love animals, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the spring of 2023, the town of Sandro, Iowa, was drowning in rain. The skies had opened up and refused to close for nearly a week. Water clung to every surface, pooled in every dip in the land, and transformed roads into winding streams. Even the central streets, usually busy with trucks and chatter, now reflected only clouds and the occasional flicker of headlights across their mirrored surfaces. On the outskirts of town, where houses thinned and gave way to overgrown lots and sagging fences, Jenna lived alone in a modest bungalow. A paramedic by trade, she had just returned from a double shift at the county clinic, her body aching in places she hadn't even known could ache. The rain had followed her home, tapping ceaselessly on the hood of her truck, soaking through the cuffs of her scrubs as she climbed out. She was tired, ready for nothing but dry clothes and silence. Usually at this hour, her dog Archie was at the gate, tail wagging in joyful arcs, ready to shepherd her inside with 1,000 eager barks. But today was different. As she stepped into the yard and unlatched the gate, she noticed him pacing, not his usual bounding excitement, but an anxious, restless rhythm. His reddish ears were flattened against his head, and he kept glancing toward the vacant lot that bordered their backyard. The lot, once slated for development, had become a wild tangle of weeds, broken tree limbs, and, after so many days of rain, an accidental marsh. Archie barked, short and sharp, then looked at Jenna as if urging her to follow. He turned again, loping toward the back fence, then returning. circling her like a rope drawing tight. Jenna frowned. Her boots squelched in the mud as she followed him across the sodden yard and around the house. The rain had lightened to a mist, but the air still hung heavy with dampness. As they neared the fence, Jenna heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound, easily mistaken for wind at first. But then it came again, more distinct, a rapid, desperate peeping, nearly drowned by the drip of rain from the eaves. Archie darted to a break in the old wooden boards and slipped through. Jenna climbed over with less grace, catching her breath as she landed in ankle-deep water on the other side. The vacant lot stretched before her like a forgotten basin, puddles merging into each other, grass flattened into dark slicks. Archie was already at the edge of one of the deeper pools, barking with a sense of urgency that made Jenna's stomach clench. She squinted into the murky water, following his gaze. There, half submerged in the muddy shallows, was a duckling. Tiny, soaked, and barely able to keep its head above water, it flailed weakly, the ripples around it fading as its energy dwindled. It must have fallen from a nearby nest or been separated from its mother during the storm. Alone, it had wandered into the water and couldn't find its way out. Archie barked again, louder now, his front paws dancing anxiously on the muddy bank. Jenna dropped to her knees, the cold water seeping instantly through her jeans. She reached for the duckling but hesitated. The mud was slick, the footing treacherous. She needed something, a stick, a scoop, anything. But there was no time to run back. The duckling was slowing, its tiny beak opening and closing without sound. Archie stepped closer, planting his paws just inches from the water, as if willing her to act. Jenna leaned forward, stretching, her arm submerged to the elbow. She brushed the wet fluff, missed, reached again, and finally, her fingers closed around the trembling, fragile body. The duckling didn't resist. It simply collapsed into her palm, spent. Jenna cradled it against her chest and sat back on her heels. Archie nosed her side, sniffing the bundle, then let out a single, low whine. The storm was quieting. Somewhere in the distance, a car splashed along a wet road, but here, in the flooded lot behind her house, it felt like the world had shrunk to the warmth of a palm, the beat of a heart, and the dog who hadn't stopped calling until someone came. The ditch was deeper than it looked. From the top, it seemed like little more than a puddle stretched into a narrow trench. But as Jenna knelt and shone her phone's flashlight into the murky depths, she realized how deceiving the water's surface had been. The rain hadn't just filled the depression. It had transformed it into a slow-moving gutter of runoff, a filthy stream lined with debris, broken twigs, and slick patches of mud that clung to every surface like glue. The duckling was still there, huddled in the shallowest bend of the channel, pressed against a piece of plastic as though trying to make it into a raft. Its feathers were soaked and matted to its tiny body, giving it a strange, flattened appearance. Every few seconds it tried to paddle upward or grip at something with its useless, trembling feet. Then it would slide down again, barely managing to keep its head above water. Archie stood beside her, shivering but unwavering. The rain came and went in bursts now, short spurts of needling drizzle followed by eerie silences. His ears twitched at every splash from below, his eyes fixed, his muscles coiled. Jenna glanced at him and then back down. The flashlight beam flickered in the water, dancing across the duckling's soaked wings. No sticks, no rope, no one around. The lot was abandoned, framed by crumbling fencing and broken signage. Jenna exhaled through her nose and looked around again, desperation sharpening her breath. She pulled off her rain jacket and twisted it into a makeshift rope, hoping to lower it gently enough for the duckling to grab, or at least climb. She dangled it down, careful not to touch the water too hard, trying to guide the fabric into position. The duckling responded. Weakly, it flapped a wing, lifted a foot, tried to clamber onto the fabric. It failed, slipped, tried again. It didn't cry out, but Jenna could see its movement slowing. Water slicked its body with every failure, dragging it down further. Jenna swore softly under her breath. She edged closer to the ditch, the mud squelching beneath her knees. Nearby, a tree had sent out thick roots, gripping the edge of the embankment like fingers. She hooked one leg around the sturdiest root, the bark damp beneath her jeans, and slid forward until she was flat on her stomach. The smell of wet soil rose in her nostrils. Cold pressed against her ribs. Stretching one arm forward, she dipped it into the water, the chill biting her skin instantly. She reached for the duckling, her fingers just inches from its bobbing head. It flinched, tried to backpedal, but there was nowhere to go. "Come on," she whispered without speaking, her lips pressed tight in concentration. She lunged that last bit of distance, submerging her entire arm to the elbow. Her hand closed around the trembling bundle. It didn't resist. It barely moved. Jenna held it gently but firmly and began to pull back. The mud sucked at her forearm like a living thing. For a second, she thought she might lose balance, slide forward, fall in herself. But her leg held against the tree root, and Archie's presence, close, solid, steadied her. She dragged herself backward, inch by inch, until her hand, and the duckling cradled within it, broke the surface again. Archie whined, stepping forward, his nose twitching as Jenna curled protectively around the duckling, shielding it from the wind. Its body was like paper in her palm, light, shaking, barely warm. She pressed it close to her chest. For a long moment she didn't move, just breathed. The ditch gurgled beneath her. The rain dripped from leaves and fence posts. Archie sat down, watching the duckling with ears perked and paws muddy. Jenna finally sat up, cradling the duckling against the inside of her shirt, letting her body heat seep through the soaked fabric. The level of the water hadn't dropped. The ditch was still dangerous, but the duckling was no longer part of. Archie barked again, sharp, piercing, cutting through the drizzle and wind like a flare in sound. It wasn't the kind of bark he used for play or strangers or squirrels. It was urgent, rhythmic. A call, not a warning. A voice cast into the quiet in the hope that someone, anyone, would hear it. And someone did. A few houses down, behind a hedge blooming with water-heavy lilacs, Mrs. Hoffman paused. The leash in her hand tugged slightly as her small terrier sniffed the wet grass, but her attention was elsewhere. She'd lived in Sandro her whole life, and she knew the voices of its animals as much as its people. That bark wasn't random. It was pleading. She turned, squinting through the mist toward Jenna's yard, just visible beyond the vacant lot. What she saw made her gasp. Jenna, sprawled half-submerged at the edge of the ditch, one arm cradling something, and the dog, soaked to the skin, barking with everything he had in him. Mrs. Hoffman didn't hesitate. She turned and began to shuffle back toward her house, faster than she'd moved in months. Her phone didn't always catch signal in the rain, so instead she called out, a wavering but loud "Help!" down the street. A few doors away, Ray had just finished dumping compost when he heard her. He didn't ask questions. He grabbed a long branch from the brush pile out back and ran barefoot across the muddy field, dodging puddles, shirt already sticking to his skin. By the time he arrived, Jenna was sitting upright, cradling the duckling inside her shirt, but her face was pale and strained. She pointed at the edge of the ditch, where sticks and plastic debris had wedged together, forming a dam of sorts. Though the duckling was out, the water was still rising slightly, and another piece of plastic fluttered, threatening to suck under what little ground remained. Ray offered her the branch. She took it, angled it with care, and reached forward. Her first attempt nudged the trash pile but didn't dislodge it. The second push shifted one of the larger pieces, a broken soda bottle, split and curled like a claw. It gave way with a slurp of mud and floated free. The water around the area began to shift, draining more quickly now. What had been a choking puddle around the duckling's feet turned to shallow trickles. The makeshift dam had broken. Archie stopped barking. Instead, he whined, a soft, low sound, as he stepped forward and sniffed at the bundle tucked in Jenna's arms. His nose brushed against a tiny, shivering wing. The duckling stirred weakly. Its eyes fluttered. "Still with us?" Jenna murmured, her voice rough from cold and adrenaline. Mrs. Hoffman arrived a minute later, breathless and holding out a thermos of warm tea she'd grabbed on the way. Behind her came another neighbor, a retired school teacher who offered a dry blanket and helped Jenna to her feet. The duckling didn't make a sound, but it no longer looked like it was slipping away. The trembling had slowed. Its head rested against the soft wool of Jenna's flannel. Its feet were tucked close to its body now, not kicking aimlessly in panic. No one tried to take Archie's place beside her. He walked calmly behind as they all headed back toward the houses, his head held low, his gait steady. Jenna didn't need to say a word. He had called, and the world had answered. They returned home as three: Jenna, Archie, and the duckling bundled in a faded kitchen towel. Jenna cleared the table with one hand, cradling the trembling creature in the other. She filled a shallow ceramic bowl with warm water and set it inside an old shoebox, then placed the duckling nearby. It moved instinctively toward the warmth, its damp feathers clinging to its tiny body. Its beak clicked softly, not in distress, but in something closer to relief. Archie lay down beside the box without needing to be asked. His ears twitched at every movement. His nose hovered just above the edge. Every so often, he nudged closer, not to interfere, just to feel the faint warmth of breath, to reassure himself the duckling was still there. Jenna watched him for a long time. She remembered the moment she'd seen him at the shelter 2 years earlier. Wide-eyed, too quiet for a spaniel, tail not wagging but gently tapping the floor whenever someone walked by. She hadn't picked him for energy or obedience. She'd picked him because of the way he looked at her, steady and patient, like someone who had learned to wait. Tonight, that look returned. As Jenna knelt beside him, Archie raised his head just enough to meet her gaze. He didn't wag. He didn't move. But in his eyes, she saw what she hadn't before. Not just instinct, but memory, intention. He hadn't just barked because something moved. He had seen the duckling, understood it was helpless, and decided to call until someone came, until someone helped, until he wasn't alone in knowing. The duckling stirred again. Its body still trembled faintly, but it no longer looked like it was folding into itself. Its tiny chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm, too fragile for the wild, but enough for now. Jenna reached out and gently touched its side through the towel. It was warm, not hot, not cold, just warm. The house was quiet now. Outside, the rain had slowed to a murmur against the windows. The streetlights cast hazy halos through the mist still clinging to the ground. Inside, a single lamp lit the small kitchen with gold. Jenna stayed by the box even after Archie dozed off. She wasn't tired anymore. Or maybe she was, but in a way that felt earned. The duckling's heart was small, but it beat. And sometimes, she thought, it took another small heart to notice, to care, to call loud enough that someone would listen. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the kitchen blinds. The rain had finally stopped, but puddles still mirrored the sky, and the ground held the hush of water-soaked earth. Jenna brewed a cup of coffee she didn't drink. Instead, she sat beside the makeshift nest, watching the duckling stretch its neck and peep softly into the warm stillness of the room. Archie was already awake. He hadn't moved far all night. His eyes tracked the duckling's every shift, not with tension, but with quiet attention, as if committing it to memory. Jenna knelt down and gently picked up the duckling, wrapping it again in the towel. It squirmed for a second, then settled into her hands. She had called the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center early. A woman named Marta had answered. Her voice was calm and efficient, the kind of voice that handled small lives daily. She asked a few questions and then gave directions to a facility 20 miles out, just past the county line. "Bring him in by noon," Marta said. "We'll do our best." Jenna nodded, though no one could see it, while she packed a soft carrier with towels, water, and a note about the night before. Archie stood beside the box, tail low, ears turned slightly back. Jenna glanced at him and hesitated. Then, without a word, she picked up the duckling and placed it gently in front of the dog one last time. The duckling blinked, turned its small head, and stepped forward. It tapped Archie's front paw with its beak. Soft, quick, almost like a question, or maybe a thank you. Archie didn't flinch. His tail gave one slow wag. Then he stepped back and lay down, head resting on his paws, as if understanding something was ending. The ride to the center was quiet. Jenna drove slowly. Archie sat in the back seat, his head near the carrier. The duckling didn't make a sound. At the center, the handoff was smooth. Marta examined the duckling with practiced care, then smiled. "He's stronger than I expected." "Good work," she said. Jenna shook her head. "It wasn't me." She looked at Archie. "He found him. He didn't stop barking until I came." Marta bent down to scratch Archie behind the ear. "Well," she said softly, "that's one good dog." Back in the car, Archie sat quietly. He didn't look out the window. He didn't sniff around the empty carrier. He simply curled up as if something inside him had gently settled. For a single night, they had been a pack. The rescuer, the witness, the saved. A fleeting, accidental family formed not from blood or habit, but from the sheer act of responding. And that was enough. A month later, Jenna received a letter from a volunteer at the Wildlife Rescue Center. It arrived in a plain envelope, the kind usually filled with bills or flyers. But inside was a handwritten note and a photograph. The note was brief, but warm. "The duckling is doing well. He's learned to swim, eats on his own, and, you'll like this, he seems to be drawn to dogs. We decided to name him Archie." Jenna smiled, her thumb brushing the corner of the photo. It showed a small duckling in mid-step, his wings just slightly open, waddling toward a large shepherd mix lying in the grass. The resemblance was a stretch, but the spirit, the soft alertness, the watchfulness, it was unmistakable. That evening, she sat on the front porch long after the sun went down. The sky was still streaked with soft light, and the breeze carried the smell of wet earth and lilacs. Archie lay at her feet, his body warm against the boards, his ears twitching now and then at distant sounds. She ran her hand slowly down his back, feeling the weight and calm of him. He had no idea that his name had been passed on to a creature he had saved. No idea that in the quiet moment when he barked toward the flooded ditch, he had changed the ending of someone else's story. And maybe he didn't need to know. Because Archie didn't bark to be praised. He didn't bark to be a hero. He barked because something small was in trouble, and he heard it. Jenna looked at him and thought of all the moments we miss. The cries we don't hear. The steps we don't take. The lives we never intersect because we're too distracted or too busy or too unsure. But not Archie. Archie listened. And sometimes that's all it takes. A single voice raised not for itself but for another. A single moment when someone stops, looks, acts. Sometimes rescue doesn't begin with a person. Sometimes it begins with a bark. In 2016, in the small town of Lawrence Falls, Oregon, every morning brought the same quiet sight behind the local grocery store. A dog, pale-coated, with kind eyes and tattered ears, sat near the rusted dumpsters, watching the flow of people with calm patience. Her name was Molly, though no one could quite say who first called her that. She wasn't wild, not truly, just cautious, as creatures who live too long without promises must become. Molly had learned the rhythm of the town. She knew the faces that passed by, the ones who hurried, the ones who lingered. More importantly, she remembered the ones who left small kindnesses behind. A broken sandwich from a schoolboy, a sliver of ham from the old man with the crooked hat, a warm bundle of meatloaf wrapped in foil from Karen, the pharmacist who worked across the street. Molly never begged. She never barked or pawed at strangers. She simply sat, tail tucked neatly around her paws, her gaze steady but not pleading, as if she was making a quiet ledger, a careful tally of every good deed tucked away in the folds of her mind. Some days she would move from the grocery lot to the alley behind the bakery, where the smell of yeast and sugar filled the air. Other days she stayed by the pharmacy, waiting until dusk when Karen's shift ended and the woman's familiar figure would cross the road carrying a small parcel. By now, Molly belonged to the town as much as any building or tree. She had stitched herself into its days without fanfare. She was a silent witness to the kindnesses too small for others to notice, a keeper of invisible debts that only she seemed to remember. And though she never asked for anything, people gave. Not out of pity, but because something in Molly's quiet dignity made them want to be a little better, even if just for a moment. And Molly, for her part, remembered every single act. Everything shifted on a gray October afternoon. Karen had stayed late at work, her shift dragging past dusk into the damp loneliness of early evening. When she finally stepped outside, the world was shrouded in mist. The streetlights cast dim halos on the empty parking lot behind the pharmacy, and her footsteps echoed too loudly against the cracked pavement. Halfway across the lot, a voice called out. Karen turned instinctively, already regretting it. A man stood there, a stranger. His voice was soft, almost polite, but something in it unsettled her. It wasn't what he said. It was the way he said it. Too low, too deliberate. Karen's pulse quickened. She gripped her purse tighter and picked up her pace, her shoes slipping slightly on the slick ground. The man followed, his steps too close behind. She thought about shouting, but knew somehow that no one would hear. The surrounding buildings loomed, their windows dark and lifeless. The mist swallowed sound just as it swallowed light. And then, out of the shifting grayness, came Molly. The dog appeared without warning, a silent figure drawn from the fog itself. She placed herself directly between Karen and the stranger, her body low and steady, her head lifted. She didn't bark. She didn't snap. She simply stood there, a solid wall of muscle and instinct, a presence impossible to ignore. A low growl vibrated from deep within her chest, not loud, but full of promise. The stranger froze. His posture shifted, his confidence draining as he took a step back. He glanced around as if realizing, maybe for the first time, that he wasn't in control. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the mist, swallowed up by the fog and the dark. Karen stood rooted to the spot, her breath catching in her throat, her body trembling not just from fear, but from the sudden shock of being saved. She felt warmth against her hand, a soft, steady breath. Molly had moved closer, pressing her damp nose into Karen's palm, grounding her back into the world. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The fog continued to swirl around them, but now it felt different. Less empty, less cold. Molly had remembered. And when the moment came, she had answered. Molly didn't leave right away. After the encounter in the fog, she followed Karen all the way back to the pharmacy's door. She didn't bark, didn't demand anything. She simply sat there, her body a quiet shadow pressed against the entrance. Karen hesitated only a moment before slipping inside, returning minutes later with an old blanket and a bowl of warm soup. She placed them carefully beside the dog, not forcing, not pleading. Then she sat down on the steps herself, drawing her knees to her chest, keeping silent company. That night, for the first time, Molly stayed. She curled herself into a tight ball on the worn doormat, her body small against the vast coldness of the concrete. The night was heavy with mist and the occasional distant sounds of traffic, but Molly did not move. She kept her vigil by the door, as if by some silent agreement that neither she nor Karen had needed to speak aloud. The next morning, when the other pharmacy workers arrived, they simply exchanged glances. No one told the dog to leave. No one suggested moving her along. They stepped over her with the kind of quiet deference reserved for things that had earned their place. For Karen, it marked the beginning of something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. A bond built not through ownership or command, but through presence, through shared spaces and quiet understandings. She bought a leash, a simple collar with a tag that read Molly. She called the local vet, who agreed to come by and give Molly a checkup right there on the sidewalk, where the dog felt safe. Vaccinations, a check of the ears, a brushing of her tangled fur. But Molly didn't become a house dog. She still roamed the streets during the day, sitting near the grocery store dumpsters, wandering through the small city park, trailing behind school children who dropped crumbs without knowing. She lived by her old rhythms, by the instinct to watch and remember. Only now, she wasn't invisible. Now the town saw her, really saw her. She had chosen them once, in the fog and fear of a parking lot. And somehow, in their small, human ways, they were learning to choose her back. Winter came early to Lawrence Falls that year, blanketing the streets with a heavy, wet snow that muffled sound and blurred the sharpness of familiar corners. Life slowed, and the town huddled inward, small shops closing early, children bundled up in scarves and mittens, the air forever tinged with wood smoke. It was during this quiet season that something new appeared on the community board outside City Hall, a small, makeshift memorial to Molly. At first it was just a photo. Someone had pinned it there, a slightly crumpled image of Molly sitting proudly in front of the grocery store, her pale fur dusted with dirt, her ears cocked at odd angles. Beneath it, in a child's scrawl, were the words, "Thank you, Molly. You're our good girl." Within days, more items began to gather. Handwritten notes from bus drivers, recalling how Molly would walk the same route as the afternoon buses, escorting kids who were late or confused. A letter from a shopkeeper who swore that one evening, when he had forgotten to lock his back door, Molly had barked and refused to leave until he came out and secured it. Little drawings from elementary school children, showing Molly with cartoonishly big eyes and a superhero cape. Stories poured in, each one like a thread, weaving a larger portrait of a dog who had built her life not from a single act of loyalty, but from 1,000 small, persistent kindnesses. Her memory was her map. Her heart was her compass. Molly had learned, in her own quiet way, to watch over the people who had once extended a hand or a crust of bread. She didn't protect the town because anyone had trained her to. She did it because it was hers, because they had become hers. One bitterly cold afternoon, a more urgent story was added to Molly's growing legend. A teenage girl named Emily was walking home from the library, cutting through the woods the way she often did when she was running late. The shortcut crossed a narrow creek, usually no more than a trickle, but winter runoff had swelled it into a treacherous stream. Emily slipped on a patch of ice near the bank, tumbling down into the freezing water. She struggled, fighting against the current and the sharp rocks beneath the surface, but exhaustion pulled at her limbs, heavy and merciless. The cold bit into her, slowing her movements until even calling for help became impossible. Somehow, somewhere between the shallow breaths and the growing dark, Molly found her. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was memory. Earlier that fall, Emily had shared part of her sandwich with Molly on the school steps. A simple act, half forgotten. The smell of bread and ham lingered on the girl's backpack. It was enough. Enough for Molly to track her through the snow. Enough for her to hear what no one else could. The faint, desperate splashes in the creek. Molly lunged into the water without hesitation, her teeth fastening onto the strap of Emily's backpack. She pulled, bracing her paws against the slippery stones. Again and again she pulled, until Emily's body slid far enough onto the icy bank that Molly could stand over her, barking, loud and sharp, sending alarm through the woods. A passing runner heard. Help came. Emily survived, though she spent several days recovering in the hospital, her parents never leaving her side. She told everyone the same thing. It wasn't the doctors who had found her first. It was Molly. After that, The tribute wall outside City Hall grew even larger. Someone laminated the first photo so it wouldn't warp in the snow. Children tied bright scarves around the tree nearest the board, the scarves fluttering like tiny flags in the winter wind. Volunteers started organizing Molly walks, evenings where townsfolk would retrace her usual routes together, picking up litter, leaving food for strays, or simply walking in quiet remembrance. In every corner of Lawrence Falls, there was a feeling now, a kind of unspoken understanding. That kindness mattered, that it was never wasted, that somewhere, even if you forgot the gesture yourself, someone might remember. Molly had remembered, and because of that, a girl was alive. And because of that, a whole town was a little less alone. Spring arrived in Lawrence Falls with a rush of color and noise. After the heavy snows and long silences of winter, the town came alive almost overnight. Tulips pushing through the soft earth, flags fluttering from storefronts, children's laughter spilling into the streets like an unstoppable tide. To celebrate, the town organized its annual Spring Festival, a tradition older than most of the buildings surrounding the square. This year, the crowd was larger than anyone had expected. Stalls overflowed with food and handmade crafts. A band played cheerful songs from the rickety stage, and every patch of grass was claimed by folding chairs and picnic blankets. Molly sat near the center of it all, at the foot of the stage. She wasn't there for the music. She wasn't there for the treats or the games. She sat, steady and watchful, her pale fur catching the afternoon light like worn silk. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning the crowd, but not out of nervousness or fear. She was looking for faces she knew. There was the elderly man with the crooked cane, who once left bits of sausage on a paper towel behind the bakery. There was the young mother, balancing a baby on one hip, who had offered her muffins on frosty mornings. And beyond them, a cluster of teenagers who, long ago, had tossed crusts of sandwiches into her corner behind the grocery store. Each face was part of a map Molly carried inside her. Each kind gesture marked a place she had chosen to remember. The music swelled, and for a time, everything felt suspended in the bright spring air. Laughter, clinking glasses, shouts from the games booths. But crowds are fragile things, delicate balances between joy and accident. Near the center of the square, a sudden commotion broke the rhythm. Someone slipped. A boy, small and sharp-boned, maybe 9 or 10, stumbled in the packed throng. Adults jostled, pivoting without seeing him, their momentum turning him into a forgotten weight underfoot. A cry split the air, but it was lost under the music. Molly moved before anyone else. She wove through the crowd with surprising speed, her body low but determined. She nudged, pushed, wriggled between knees and chairs, using her size not as a battering ram, but as a thread pulling attention where it was desperately needed. At last, she reached the boy, standing protectively over him, nudging his arm with her nose until he struggled upright, dazed but unhurt. Her tail wagged once, slow and reassuring. Now others noticed. Hands reached down, steadying the boy, pulling him back into safety. Someone turned off the music. Murmurs spread through the crowd like ripples over water. And at the center of it all sat Molly, calm, alert, unbothered by the fuss, as if she had simply done what was necessary and nothing more. In the days that followed, people spoke differently about her. They no longer called her just a stray or a lucky dog. They spoke of her as something deeper, a thread woven through the fabric of their town. A quiet force that tied the edges of the community together, not with words or banners, not with parades or speeches, but with the memory of every small kindness she had never forgotten. Molly had become a bridge, invisible but unbreakable, between people who might have otherwise remained strangers, and Lawrence Falls, though they might not have said it aloud, was better for it. Summer in Lawrence Falls arrived heavy and slow, pressing down with the scent of melted asphalt and wilting flowers. The town baked under a wide, blinding sky, the days stretching long and bright until even the shadows seemed tired. Molly still made her rounds. She moved through the familiar streets at her own pace, no longer swift, but steady. Her gait had softened into a careful shuffle, her once strong legs now stiff with age. The pale fur on her muzzle had faded into a mist of white, and the patches along her flanks thinned under the weight of passing seasons. But her eyes were unchanged. They still held that quiet light, a warmth that saw without judgment, a patience that carried the memory of every open hand, every kind gesture tucked away inside her like treasures. On hot afternoons, she lay in the shade behind the old grocery store, where the scent of baked bread and ripening fruit drifted through open doors. She watched people pass, the faces familiar, the stories familiar. She did not need to chase or beg. She simply was, a part of the town's living, breathing rhythm. No one knew exactly when Molly slipped away. One morning, she simply did not rise from a resting place beneath the sprawling lilac bushes behind the pharmacy. She had curled herself into the cool earth, hidden beneath a shield of fragrant blooms. Her body was still, her breathing quieted into the hush of the world itself. It was the shop owner who found her, and within hours, it seemed, the entire town knew. At the door of City Hall, a new plaque appeared, hand-painted and hung with gentle hands. For Molly, who remembered all of us. Children left drawings, elderly women left scraps of poetry, strangers left bowls of fresh water beneath the lilac, evening after evening, long after there was no one left to drink it. Not because they believed she would return, but because some presences, some kindnesses, leave paths worn deeper than footsteps. Because memory, too, is a kind of trail, a way through the world that never really fades. And Molly's trail, invisible but enduring, would remain woven into the heart of Lawrence Falls long after the heat softened, long after the lilacs shed their blooms, long after even those who had fed her once had themselves been forgotten. The town kept walking those old paths, because some trails are too full of love to ever truly disappear.
In November of 1998, in the quiet town of Ashland, Oregon, on the edge of a thinning forest, stood a small house with peeling white paint and a chimney that no longer smoked as often as it once did. It was the kind of house that didn't draw attention, nestled behind leafless trees and half-fallen fences, forgotten by most, remembered only by routine. This was where Rachel Lawrence lived, a 74-year-old widow whose life had narrowed to the perimeter of that house and the worn path between porch and mailbox. A year had passed since her husband, Frank, died from cancer. Since then, the silence inside the house had changed its nature. It no longer offered comfort or rest. It had grown thick, stale, and suffocating. The kind of silence that seemed to press against the walls, to follow her from room to room. She spoke less. There was no one to answer, no voice to return hers. Her daughter, who lived in Minnesota, called rarely and wrote even less. The neighbors who once waved across driveways had long since moved away or turned into strangers with new schedules, new lives, and little time for the woman at the end of the street. Rachel spent most of her days in a rocking chair by the front window, the one that faced the woods. She no longer watched for anything in particular, just the shifting light, the snow when it came, the shape of branches scratching at the sky. The floor creaked under her when she walked, a lonely echo in a house too large for one person. Her mornings followed a rigid script. Rise slowly, heat yesterday's coffee, open the blinds, check the mailbox, return to the chair. The clock ticked, though the hours rarely meant anything. The television often played static or muted news, which she didn't listen to. Sometimes at night, she caught sight of a barn owl perched on the leaning utility pole at the end of the road. It returned now and then, silent and still, its yellow eyes like watchful moons. It was the only other presence she'd come to expect, and even that came and went with the seasons. The cold had crept into her life without being noticed. Not just the cold that seeped through old window frames and drafty doorways, but the cold of distance, of disconnection. Her body had adjusted to it, wrapped in sweaters and blankets, but something deeper had not. There was a frost somewhere inside, quiet and persistent, spreading slowly over time. Rachel no longer expected change. Each day unfolded like a carbon copy of the last. Not painful, just numb, steady, indistinct. Life hadn't ended, not exactly, but it had paused in place, and there was no clear sign of when or if it would resume. The first snow came early that year. Without warning, it draped itself over the trees and rooftops of Ashland, blanketing the town in soft, white silence, as though winter had quietly decided to take up residence ahead of schedule. The sky, which had remained a dull slate gray for days, finally gave in and began to shed slow, heavy flakes that spiraled down like forgotten memories. They settled onto the cracked sidewalks, the rusting mailbox, and the brittle hedges that lined Rachel Lawrence's front yard. By evening, darkness had fallen completely, and the town disappeared into quiet. The wind tapped softly at the windows and groaned through the eaves. Rachel sat in her usual place by the window, her chair creaking gently as she rocked. She was used to the noises, the wind, the creaks, the occasional scratching from raccoons that wandered too close to the garbage bins. Normally, she wouldn't have looked up. But something shifted in the air that night. A sound, soft but different, brushed against the edges of her awareness. Not a knock or a call, but a movement, barely there. Her eyes drifted toward the front window, scanning the dim halo of light cast by the old street lamp at the end of the walkway. At first, she saw nothing but snow and shadows. Then, just at the edge of the porch steps, something stirred. It was a shape, small, low to the ground, nearly swallowed by the accumulating snow. She leaned forward slightly, her breath fogging the glass. The shape moved again, just barely. A faint tremble. A shift of a limb. It was a dog, curled tightly on the porch, half covered in snow. Its fur was matted with ice, and it lay so still that for a moment she wasn't sure it was alive. One of its ears twitched, and the faintest motion of a tail brushed weakly against the wooden step. It hadn't come there by accident. Somehow it had made its way to her door, as if following some invisible trail only it could sense. Rachel didn't pause to think. Her body, slow and careful for years, moved with a kind of quiet urgency. She opened the front door, letting a gust of cold air wrap around her like a forgotten coat. The dog didn't flinch, didn't lift its head. It simply lay there, exhausted, surrendered to whatever would happen next. Rachel bent down, her knees stiff, and carefully scooped the small, trembling body into her arms. It was lighter than expected, just bones wrapped in fur and ice. Inside, the warmth of the house seemed too much for the animal at first. It didn't struggle or resist. She placed it gently by the old radiator in the living room, on top of a folded quilt she hadn't touched in months. It was the one that used to lie at the foot of Frank's bed. She pulled another blanket around the dog, tucking it close. Its eyes were closed, but it breathed, shallow and steady. Rachel sat down beside it, not saying a word. Her hand hovered for a moment, then settled on the edge of the blanket. The radiator hissed softly. Snow continued to fall outside. The television buzzed in the next room, forgotten. The house, so long emptied of warmth, seemed to shift almost imperceptibly. And for the first time in a very long time, Rachel wasn't alone. The days passed slowly, measured not by the clock, but by small, almost imperceptible changes in the house. The dog remained near the radiator at first, barely moving except to shift her weight or adjust the angle of her thin body beneath the blanket. Her eyes stayed open most of the time, watching, always watching. Rachel began calling her little one, a name spoken gently, never with finality. She didn't dare name her, as if doing so might tie them together in a way she wasn't ready for, as if a name would make her real in a way Rachel might not be able to bear. The dog didn't eat at first. Food was placed beside her, dry toast, softened by broth, small bits of apple, crumbs of bread, but it would sit untouched for hours. Then one morning, a crust disappeared. The next day, a slice was licked clean. With each bite, however small, something shifted in the house. Not in sound or sight, but in feeling. It was as if the very air began to move again, like a long shuttered window finally opened, letting something living back inside. The house, once heavy with silence, became subtly different. The dog did not bark, did not whine. Her presence was quiet, like a shadow that had learned to stay still. Yet Rachel felt it. She felt the weight of those eyes following her through each room. They were not fearful, nor demanding, just constant. In their steadiness, Rachel found something unexpected: comfort. She began to move with more purpose. She stood longer in the kitchen. She washed dishes not immediately, but with care, almost ritual. She warmed up the oven and, one afternoon, rolled out pie crust for the first time in over a year. The scent of cinnamon and butter drifted through the rooms, unfamiliar and familiar at once. Her hands, stiff and weathered from arthritis, remembered the motion, as if the muscles held the memory of joy. She started to speak aloud again, not to the dog, but to herself, to the walls, to the corners that had listened in silence for too long. Her voice, once trapped in her chest, began to stretch, to hum, to test its shape in the open air. The house absorbed her words and echoed them gently, like a cathedral with no congregation. She didn't need answers, just the act of hearing her own sound was enough. The dog's condition improved with time. She began to stand on shaky legs, to follow Rachel from room to room, always at a cautious distance. By dusk, she would settle near the rocking chair, curling up at Rachel's feet. Her breath was soft, her gaze unblinking, and there was something sacred in her stillness, as though she were guarding something fragile and unspoken. Rachel, in turn, began to knit again. Her needles clicked quietly in the evenings, her fingers working yarn into shape as they had many winters before. She wasn't sure what she was making, a scarf, perhaps, or just a long strand of comfort. Her fingers moved more easily now, as if warmed by the steady presence of the creature beside her. It wasn't companionship in the ordinary sense. There were no games, no tricks, no commands obeyed. But between them stretched something intangible, like a thread gently tying one soul to another. They existed in the same space, not needing to speak, not needing to understand, simply sharing the silence that once separated them. And in that silence, something small but vital began to grow. In the final days of December, the storm arrived without warning. It came like a closing fist, fast, sharp, unrelenting. Winds howled across the valley, shaking windows in their frames and tearing through the trees with a sound that resembled an ancient, unearthly roar. Snow followed in thick waves, not soft and drifting, but heavy, angled, and punishing. It blanketed the town in white blindness, blurring the edges of everything familiar. In Rachel's small house at the end of Hazel Street, the lights flickered once, twice, and then surrendered to the darkness. The power went out just after sunset. The hum of the refrigerator faded into silence, and the radio gave one last sputter before dying. Outside, the telephone line, already brittle from the cold, snapped somewhere down the road, silencing the only connection she had left with the outside world. Rachel stood in the middle of her living room, wrapped in 2 sweaters, staring at the unmoving light bulb above. She felt the isolation settle over her like a second winter. She moved carefully, lighting candles one by one, placing them around the room as if arranging tiny guards against the dark. The fireplace, long unused, was coaxed into life, its breath shallow but warm. She sat close, the dog at her feet, motionless but watchful. The flicker of the flames danced in the animal's dark eyes, reflecting something ancient and uncertain. Rachel placed another log into the fire, feeling the pull of fatigue in her limbs, the weariness that had grown heavier in recent months. As night deepened and the wind outside grew louder, a worry bloomed in her chest. The wood inside the house wouldn't last till morning. She had meant to bring more in earlier that day, but time had slipped by, as it often did. Now the stack was low, and the storm showed no sign of slowing. Her breath curled in the air. The heat was already fading. Just after midnight, when the cold began to bite through her second layer of clothing, Rachel decided to try. The thought of making it through the night without fire was worse than the risk of a short walk. The woodshed wasn't far, just down the side path, past the empty flower bed and around the corner of the house. She put on her boots slowly, fingers stiff against the laces, and pulled a coat over her shoulders. The dog watched her from the hearth, but did not follow. The front door opened with effort. Snow had piled against it, resisting her push like a warning. She stepped outside, and the wind met her with teeth. The cold was not sharp. It was deep, ancient, the kind that sank into the joints and pressed against the ribs. She moved slowly, feet crunching over the hard-packed snow, one hand pressed against the side of the house for balance. The flashlight she carried cast a narrow beam, quickly swallowed by the swirling white. She was halfway to the shed when it happened. Her foot found a patch of hidden ice beneath the snow. She slipped, her arms flailed for a moment in silence, and then gravity took hold. She landed hard on her side. The breath rushed from her lungs. A sharp pain exploded in her hip and down her leg. For a moment she couldn't move. The flashlight dropped into the snow, its beam turning skyward like a useless signal. She tried to sit up, but the pain anchored her. The wind shrieked over her body, tossing snow across her face, piling it over her coat. Her gloved hands scrabbled against the frozen ground, searching for leverage, but the strength wasn't there. She lay still, her pulse thudding against the cold inside her ears. The sky above her was dark, unbroken, without stars. Snowflakes clung to her eyelashes, melting against the warmth of her skin. Her mind began to drift, pulled loose by shock and exhaustion. She thought of Frank, of the way he used to read the newspaper out loud every morning. She thought of the letters she never sent, folded and stored in drawers. She thought of the dog sleeping by the fire, unaware. Her breathing slowed. The pain began to dull into something distant, like a sound heard through thick glass. Her eyes closed. And then there was nothing. At the very moment Rachel fell into the snow, the dog stirred from her place by the fireplace. Something had changed. The stillness of the house had shifted in a way only instinct could detect. There was no sound, no call, no clear disturbance, just an absence where presence had been only moments before. She lifted her head slowly, ears alert, nose twitching toward the closed front door. The fire still flickered behind her, casting long shadows along the walls, but the warmth no longer felt complete. She moved toward the door, hesitantly at first, her body still weak from recovery. Her paws touched the cold wooden floor, and a small whimper escaped her chest. She scratched once, then again, pressing her weight against the lower panel. The door groaned but did not yield. She paced once in a tight circle, then returned to the frame and pressed again, harder this time, until the latch gave slightly. A sharp gust of wind filled the room, bringing with it the sting of the storm. The dog slipped through the gap into the darkness beyond. Outside, the snow bit at her face and sides, each flake a needle, each gust a wall. She moved slowly at first, then with more purpose, lowering her nose to the ground. The wind tore away most scents, scattering any clear trail, but still she pushed forward. She had no training, no understanding of what she was doing, only something deep and unspoken guiding her, something that told her this was wrong, that the person who had saved her was now lost. She moved past the porch, down the familiar path where Rachel often walked to the shed. The snow here was deeper, drifted into strange shapes that changed the landscape. She paused, sniffed, then veered left, circling toward the back of the property. Her paws sank deep into the crusted snow, legs trembling with the effort. Still, she did not stop. Behind the shed, partially shielded from the wind by a low slope of earth and the wall of the building, she found her. A barely visible shape beneath the snow, a mound where there should have been nothing. The flashlight lay nearby, its beam weak and fading, buried in white. The dog approached slowly, cautiously, nose quivering, and then she recognized the scent, cold, fading, but still present. Rachel was motionless, her body half covered by snow, one arm stretched out awkwardly beneath her coat. Her skin was pale, lips barely parted, her breath too shallow to see. The dog sniffed at her shoulder, then her cheek, stepping closer with trembling limbs. She circled once, then curled tightly against her side, pressing herself along the length of the woman's torso. She did not bark. She did not panic. She simply lay there, her thin frame pushed against Rachel's body, her breath slow and warm. The dog's ribs rose and fell steadily, her heartbeat strong and close. Snow continued to fall over them both, forming a white cocoon, erasing the line between body and ground. Still, she did not move. The wind howled through the trees, but the space behind the shed remained strangely calm, as if the world had paused there for a moment. Time passed without measure, marked only by the dog's breathing and the faint beat of warmth that passed between them. Dawn arrived without ceremony. A faint, colorless light crept across the sky, brushing the tops of trees and rooftops. The storm had not fully passed, but the worst of it had broken. The cold remained, sharp and unforgiving. From the road, a neighbor noticed the front door of the house hanging open. Curious, concerned, he crossed the yard, boots crunching over ice. He called out once, twice, then saw the path of disturbed snow leading behind the shed. Following it, he came upon a quiet, frozen scene. Two figures lying together, half buried in white. For a moment, it looked like a sculpture, still and solemn, shaped by wind and survival. He knelt beside them. The old woman's skin was cold, but there was breath, faint, shallow, real. The dog raised her head slowly, blinking against the gray morning light, and then lowered it again onto Rachel's shoulder. She did not move away. Not yet. Help was called. Blankets arrived. But for those few minutes before others came, there was only the woman, the dog, and the silence of a storm that had tried and failed to take them both. 3 months had passed since the storm. The ice had melted, giving way to wet earth and the quiet anticipation of spring. The snowbanks receded like memory, and the trees along Hazel Street stretched their limbs toward pale sunlight. Rachel had healed slowly. Her body remained stiff, her steps uncertain, but the bruises had faded and the pain had lessened. She moved now with the help of a cane, her gait deliberate but steady. Each morning, she opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the new air, letting it fill the hollow spaces that winter had carved inside her. The dog had stayed. She had a name now. Betsy. It had come to Rachel one morning as naturally as the bloom of crocuses beneath the eaves. Betsy was no longer thin or trembling. Her fur had grown thick and healthy, her body stronger, though her quiet nature remained unchanged. She followed Rachel everywhere with calm devotion, never straying far, never demanding more than presence. Her eyes, dark and still, remained fixed on Rachel with the same gentle curiosity as the night they first met. The house had changed, not drastically, but in ways that mattered. The windows stayed open longer during the day, the curtains drawn back to let light pool on the hardwood floors. Dust that had once settled undisturbed was swept away. Rachel began to cook again, not just for herself, but for others. Pies appeared on neighbors' porches, wrapped in foil and left without note. She wrote letters to her daughter, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet desire to reconnect. The pen moved across the page more easily now. Outside, near the window that faced east, she had begun to plant flowers. At first, just pansies and marigolds, then more. Lavender, sage, a row of tulips that bent gently in the morning breeze. She wore old gloves and moved slowly in the dirt, her cane propped beside her like a watching sentinel. Betsy sat nearby, ears alert, head resting on her front paws. She did not interfere, only remained close, her presence a kind of warmth that needed no explanation. Life had not returned all at once. It had crept back into the corners of the house, settled into the folds of Rachel's routine. It came not with grand gestures, but in quiet moments, a warm mug between her palms, the feel of sunshine on her face, the sound of birds returning to the trees. Betsy did not save her every day. She didn't need to. Her rescue had already been done, and the echo of it lingered in every shared silence, every slow step, every breath taken with intention. Rachel no longer feared the silence. It was no longer empty. It was full of small things. The soft tap of Betsy's paws across the floor, the creak of the rocking chair, the rustle of letters folded and placed into envelopes. She had begun to sleep more deeply. She dreamed, sometimes of snow, sometimes of warmth, but always with the feeling that something precious had been returned. When summer finally arrived, Rachel stood at the kitchen window one morning and pushed it open. The air was thick with life. Cut grass, distant thunder, the scent of lilac. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hand on the sill, and breathed in deeply. A breeze moved through the room, lifting the edge of a curtain, carrying with it a quiet promise. Betsy lay on the rug behind her, eyes closed, tail gently tapping the floor. Rachel didn't speak, but in the stillness, a thought moved through her like light through a tree canopy. She was not finished. There was still something left, something worth waking for, worth tending to, worth continuing. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe it.